Hello, my name is Sarami, and today I'm here to talk to you about gathers. Gathers are used to control fullness. When one pattern piece is larger than the other, we can join them together when the larger piece has been gathered to fit. You see gathers most often on waistlines, sleeve bands or cuffs, yokes, or as ruffles. Gathers are made by sewing two parallel rows of stitches at a longer stitch length and pulling the bobbin threads up to gather it to fit. The stitches act like a drawcord inside of a casing. If gathering is something you're still refining and you're looking to expand your sewing skills, check out the Sewing Basics 2 course by Sew Liberated. There you can learn minor pattern changes, how to sew on a yoke, set in a sleeve, and gathers, among other skills. And once you complete this course, you'll be well equipped to sew the Greenbrier Dress by Sew Liberated. While gathering is a fundamental sewing skill and considered a beginning or basic sewing skill, it can be quite tricky in different situations depending upon the fabric that you're using or the amount you need to gather. You can get a different result in how your gathers look depending upon the fabric weight and the stitch length, and of course, how much you need to fit into the space that you're gathering the fabric. Let me show you a few examples. Here we have a rayon challis. This is probably going to be the easiest fabric to gather. It's going to be light and drapey, and because the fabric is really compliant, you can really scrunch those gathers together. Similar fabrics would be maybe a lightweight cotton lawn or something similar like a voile. These are all going to be really easy to gather up, and you'll get a really good scrunch on those gathers. Here we have a double gauze. Now double gauze, even though it is technically 2 layers of fabric that have been stitched together, it's a pretty easy fabric to gather because this fabric here has been woven with a really small yarn or thread, if you want to look at it that way. And it's going to be really compliant when you're scrunching this up. The gathers do look a little fuller, and you can kind of see they're just a little bit chunkier than something, say, on the rayon side here. This is going to be a much boardier fabric compared to the rayon, which has a lot of drape, but it's still going to be pretty easy to gather up, and it's going to give you more of a floaty look. Now we get into a couple of fabrics here that are going to still be able to be gathered, but they're going to be crisper, a little bit harder, thicker. You'll find both of these needing a little extra effort. So this right here is a quilting cotton. It's going to probably be the stiffest of these 4 fabrics here. And you'll obviously get a really nice result with the gathers. It really likes that, but it's going to be a little bit harder to scrunch a lot of fabric into a small space. And the same goes for this one here, which is a linen cotton blend. It's got more drape along the lines of what you'd use for a fabric for sewing clothing. It's also more open weave than a quilting cotton, so it's going to be a little more compliant. So you can kind of see what these all look like from the back. They look very similar. And you can really see that those rayon gathers really like to scrunch in there. So let me show you what it's like to gather each of these up. Now for this rayon sample, I'm also going to show you the difference between using a different stitch length when you sew your gathering rows here. So on this one here, I used a size 4 stitch length, which usually means 4 millimeters. Sometimes stitch length is referred to as stitches per inch. I'm going to refer to it as the millimeter since most machines have it as 1, 2, 3, 4 setting, and that's what we're using here for Sew Liberated. I sewed all of these with my fabric face up, and that just helps me remember that the underside is my bobbin threads, and those are the best ones to choose. If you forget and choose the top threads, that's okay. Don't start over. Just remember that you need to choose the exact same threads that you're pulling at each end. If you chose the bobbin threads at one end and the top threads at the other end, they'll lock up and then you will be kind of stuck in the gathering. So I usually like to grab my awl or something like that, and I loosen the stitch up if I need to. I really like the threads to be the same length. It helps a lot because if one is a lot longer, you might end up pulling one more than the other. And I'm just going to slide them together here. So this one right here is the longer stitch length, so it's the size 4. You can see really how easy this is, and you want to pull from both ends. And now I'm just gather it up. I'll just kind of evenly distribute it here. And I like to give it a nice tug at the bottom to kind of straighten out those gathers so they're not too rumpled. Very easy. So now this one here has been sewn with a 2.5 length stitch. It's going to be a little firmer to pull, but you're going to get a finer gather because the stitch is shorter. That means the little pleat that we're creating inside each of the stitches is going to be a smaller little pleat. This is really nice when you have a very lightweight fabric or fine fabric. You're not going to be able to get this with a heavier weight fabric. You'll probably just break the threads. All right, and so now here I'm going to give it my little tug. Straighten it out. And you can kind of see that this is the smaller stitch length here, and this is the larger stitch length here. It's going to probably be a little trickier to see on camera, but you're going to get a nicer, more, just a little smaller gather with the shorter stitch length. All right, and so now for this double gauze, this one too is going to be pretty easy to gather up, you can see, and you get really nice looking gathers with the double gauze. It's pretty easy. And now on the quilting cotton here, I usually like to leave really long tails, but my machine automatically cuts the thread at the end of the row. All right, so you can see we get really nice gathers with this too. It's a little stiffer. So if you have a shorter space to fit the fabric, sometimes you'll find that the bulk of the fabric is not going to allow you to be able to scrunch it up small enough to fit into the space that you're given. And then here we have this linen cotton blend, which is going to be really similar to just a plain linen. This is probably a little lighter weight than a 100% linen. And this one's going to be a little bit chunkier, just like the quilting cotton, but it still wants to gather up. All of these are going to give you a really nice look. It's just a little bit different from fabric to fabric. When you're ready to sew your gathered pieces to the non-gathered pieces, you're going to find that there's usually notches to line up. So you can section the gathers between landmarks. And on the Greenbrier dress, we have notches on the skirt that match to these seams here. And then we have our side seams to match to our underarm seam. So this way we have something to guide us and we can evenly distribute the gathers along the way. Similarly, on the Hinterland dress, we line up our centers right here and our side seams. Now, if you ever need an additional notch, you're not given enough, you can always add some by placing them at the center, since that's always a really good place to start lining up your gathers. This is what it would look like on the pattern pieces here. So here is the front bodice of the Greenbrier, and you can see that I've drawn in the seam allowance to the size that I cut out along the center and on this armhole seam here. And I did the same on this sleeve pattern piece here. Here is the part that goes into the waist. So here's the underarm seam, and here is the armhole seam. And then on the skirt here, you can see we have the center front right here. The skirt is on the fold and it lines up with the center front bodice. And then we have this seam right here lines up to this notch on the skirt. That's our guiding landmark. And then we have the side seam to the underarm. So it's a really great way to section off your gathers, pin at the landmarks, and then you just gather to fit in between these sections. All right, so let's do a little trial run because I have a couple more tips that I want to share with you. So here I have a practice piece and there are seams right here. And we have this little stretch here that we're going to fit this lower section into. So now I have notches for my seams to go to on either side of my fake bodice. And then if we wanted another notch, we felt like we didn't have enough, you can always find the center of both the pieces that you're working on. And I will sometimes cut a little corner off, and then this way, when it's gathered up, it's a little easier to see than if I were to just cut a snip into it like this. So now here, this one. We could do a snip or we could do the corner because this side doesn't get gathered. But the corner, the little V being gone actually is a nice signal so that I know that the V's go together and the seam goes to this notch. So let's add our gathering stitches. All right, we're going to use a size 4 stitch length. And usually when we do seams like this, we don't go through the seam in one long continuous gathering stitch. We're going to stop our gathering stitches and start them again on either side of the seam. And I sometimes like to overlap them, kind of nesting them together like this. That way I can have gathers right there as well, because you're going to find that where the gathering stitches end, that's where it's going to be the flattest without the most gathers, unless you overlap your gathering stitches. Also, pulling your gathering stitches through the seam is a little bit too much for the thread to handle, especially on heavier fabrics. So for this little tiny section, we're just going to sew up to here and then probably just right up to the seam there. And I'm going to sew just inside my full seam allowance on the seam allowance side of that seam. So if this seam allowance is 5/8 of an inch, I'm going to sew just to the right of that, maybe at a fat 1/2 inch. And if you can remember to leave yourself a longer tail, it might be easier, especially for the bobbin threads. Your machine probably doesn't automatically cut the bobbin threads like mine does, but we're going to try and remember to not cut them at each seam. So I pull out a tail and clip, and now I have my next tail ready for the next seam. And I try not to sew any of these threads. There's a lot of little threads from the fabric happening here, but try not to stitch over your tails for the gathering stitches. All right, now we're going to repeat with another parallel row, and I'm going to make sure all these little thread tails don't get sewn on. So I'm just going to push them below, down here. And I'm going to sew this next row 1/4 of an inch away. All right, so now let's look at our little sections here. And we're going to work from the back side. Going to untangle some of these. I'm going to give them a little gentle tug so that I can kind of get them going, and I can get these threads sort of tied together. And then we can get this little section going here. Now this little section is very small, so you got to make sure that, especially on these smaller sections, you're pulling from each end, because if you pull too much, you'll pull your threads straight through, just kind of like on your hoodie when you pull your drawstring a little too much and you lose it all the way through. So here we have this little section here. We can kind of start looking at, okay, we can let go of some of these. And we're looking at the seam to the notch there. And this is pretty close. I'd rather have it a little bit tighter than loose because I can always let it go as I'm sewing it on. All right, so now let's look at this middle section here. You can see I didn't overlap my gathering stitches right here, mainly because with the French seam, I know that's probably going to give me trouble, and I would have to unpick it anyway and get it away from the seam. But in lighter weight fabrics like the rayons and the voile, the lawn, you can probably overlap your gathering rows. So basically you would have 2 rows up here kind of like this, and then 2 rows down here. And then that way, because you can see even when I'm gathering here, that it sort of flattens out right here, right at the beginning, no matter what you do, because you're not usually holding it all the way. You can always put a pin right here and then wrap your thread around the pin like this, and that will kind of keep it gathered all the way up to the edge, just like that. All right, and so now we're going to grab this side, make sure we have the bobbin. And like I said, if you forget to use the bobbin, I often do, if you've ever seen me sew, it's okay. It's that the bobbin tension is a little bit lighter, so it's a little easier to pull, but it's not the end of the world if you forget and you pull the top. All right, so we're going to pull a little bit on this side, And we're gonna pull a little bit on this side so that we're evenly distributed and we don't accidentally pull our threads all the way through. And then I'm just gonna hold it up here and go, all right, are we in the ballpark? And we're getting there. Here's our center notch right here. And I'm definitely making this look a little bit easier than it will be if you're using a whole skirt and a whole bodice and you're doing this in the round. Then I suggest that you just very methodically look at your sections, and when you go to sew it, just make sure that you sew with the gathers facing up. See how we did. Okay, so now we have a very good start. And we can put this right sides together. And again, I'm going to pin my landmarks first. So I'm going to pin this seam here. I'm going to pin this seam here. I would be pinning my side seam. And you know, if your skirt is in the round, you would be lining up your side seams just like I did right here. We'll do our other side seam. I sort of go back and forth. This way it's a little easier to make sure I'm distributing things. All right, and then we're gonna get our center. Center is usually the first one I do, if it's an option. And you can tell I'm not pinning that thread. Make sure you don't catch your gathering stitch because it still needs to move a little bit sometimes. And we can see like that one little section right here is a little too gathered because the bodice is gaping there. So let's just slide it a little bit. And now we're gonna sew it together. And I really find it handy to have something like an awl so that I can slide these gathers along the way. So now we're gonna sew this with our gathers side up, and we're going to put our stitch length back to our normal stitch length. And we're gonna sew to the left of these gathering stitches. Sometimes instructions will have you sew down the middle if you've placed the gathering stitches in a way to do so. And then you remove the bottom row when you're done. All right, so here we go. Now we can back stitch. Remove this pin here now that we've already anchored this end here. And now I also like to try and get as many of these pesky threads toward my seam allowance as possible, because trust me, they are kind of a pain to get rid of from the right side. And then now I'm going to slide some of these gathers toward the needle. I want it as close to the end as possible so that I have continuous gathers going all the way around. And then here too, I will sometimes hold my gathering stitches and just make sure, just like that. Now we can slide those out of the way. And I'm gonna make sure my underpiece, there's no folds. And again, here are my two gathering threads. So we're going to slide our gathers up to it. Get rid of this pin. Now I feel like the one biggest thing you want with your gathers is for them to be perpendicular to the seam that you're sewing. So making sure that you're not letting things get all haywire, like kind of sloppy there, will really help the way the gathers look on the right side. They'll be more like micro pleats than lumpy bumpy things. So now here I am, I'm just going to grab these threads again, because they are still kind of something I can scrunch up since I haven't stitched through them. And now here's our center notch right here. So let's make sure. And again, I sometimes will hold this edge and give it a good tug, just like I was showing you on the ones I sample gathered. It really makes a difference. The other thing that helps is not letting this skirt get sucked up into this seam, because it's just so disappointing when you get all the way done with such a huge step and you have to unpick a little bit of it to get rid of those little tucks and things. So gathering, while it is a basic fundamental skill for sewing, it doesn't mean that that's an easy skill. It just means that it's something you're going to need so often, you really need to learn it early on. So there's a difference between something being easy and fundamental. All right, and here we are at the end. And I do fear I'm going to get somewhat of a little flat spot since I was gabbing a little bit. but we'll try and get some back there. And again, just want all these little threads to go toward the raw edge there. And this little section looks pretty good. I'm going to hold these tiny little tails here and make sure I can slide a little of this towards the seam. There we go. I feel like I'm going to have a lot of threads in the seam because I didn't do a good job of managing that, but let's check it out. We have a few, and it's the threads that we're seeing are my sewing threads, not the fabric threads, which honestly I feel like is better, because now what I'll do is I'll open this up and I'll look for those threads here, and using an awl or a pin or a seam ripper, just grab them and pull them to the inside, just like that. Let's see, do we have them all? We have one, this one right here. I can see it sneaking. Look at that. Okay. Let's see, do we get all these here? We have one more right here. So let's try and find it. There we go. And I think we had one down here, right here. So we'll open it up here and look for which one it is. There it is. All right. And so now once you're done with this, I like to give it a nice good tug. I feel like this really makes the gathers look a lot nicer. And then you can steam it or press it. You can press your waistband. Usually you're always pressing the gather seam up to the pattern piece that didn't get gathers. And that's basically because this seam allowance here is a much thicker, heavier seam now because of all of these gathers in here. And so it's going to be hard to bend them toward the skirt. Sometimes you have to if there's a placket that is joining to the waist seam, and that's just how it is sometimes. But in most cases, these gathers are going to go up into a cuff or into a yoke, into a seam, and they'll hang a lot nicer if you can kind of be able to give them a nice little tug just like that. Good luck mastering those gathers, and if you want to learn to sew your clothes, Sew Liberated offers many courses. To find out which course or bundle is good for you, check out our Sewing GPS quiz to point you in the right direction.